Right, folks, I think we'll just get started. Can everyone hear okay?
Yes.
Thank you all for coming along to the second of many Alba equality meetings, and it is great to have it here in the Yes City of Dundee. Before I start, I would just like to say it's a great pleasure to have Tony on our platform. What a lot of people might not know is, during the run-up to the 2014 referendum, Tony, Bob Costello, Deb Brown and a lot of others went out to the streets and signed people up that has never been on the electoral register before. That's what got Dundee really high with the yes vote, and I think we should get a round of applause for that. Dundee has always been a radical city. I mean, what other city would chase out Winston Churchill and replace him with a prohibitionist Neddy Scrimmager? And can anybody remember Neddy's song for the elections? Vote, vote, vote for Neddy Scrimmager. He's in the geese, you ham and eggs. If you didn't vote for him, we will pan your windies in. So vote, vote, vote for Neddy Scrimmager. Not the kind of campaign you probably get a message for. Churchill's threat, however, of seeing the grass grow over the mills of Dundee came true. And that was due to Westminster refusing to protect our interests. Instead, they trained those from other colonies throughout the world for cheaper labour, putting many Dundee citizens on the dole. Dundee, however, did not lose its radicalness. It's said that heckling comes from Dundee women, because Dundee women held politicians to account. The word heckling actually comes from the heckle needles of a carding machine from the mills. That's the one that used to rip the fibres apart, and I have seen many Dundee women ripping a politician apart. Even our call for a Scotland United campaign for constitutional change has Dundee connections. In 1992, the John Major government got elected in an election that Labour were odds-on favourite to win. Just like today, Labour are odds-on favourite to win. At that time, they had 51 Scottish MPs elected, and still they could not stop an unpopular Tory government being re-elected. John McCallion, the then MP for Dundee East, and a couple of others started the Scotland United campaign for a Scottish Parliament. That campaign was very successful, and we had our Parliament within 10 years. So it is very possible for a quick reaction of the Scotland United campaign. The Parliament has been good for Scotland. It has created some radical changes, particularly during the Alex Salmond years. Under Alex's leadership, we saw tuition fees being abolished, free prescriptions introduced, he removed tolls from bridges, and he also froze the council tax for the duration of his leadership. However, due to being shackled to this union, he had to turn his attention to protecting our most vulnerable from the draconian cuts of Westminster, such as the bedroom tax. The Scottish Government couldn't abolish the bedroom tax, so Alex mitigated the tax so that it wouldn't affect anyone in Scotland. That brings me on to the Unionist claim that Scotland is too poor to be independent, because that great charitable organisation, Westminster, run by the angelic Tories, subsidise us poor wee Scots. Aye, they wouldn't subsidise a bedroom, never mind a country. From the very first day of this union, Scotland has been paying the debts of England. It is in fact part of the treaty. Under Article 15 of the Treaty of Union, 1707, it states Scotland shall be liable for the debts of England. Even coming up to the modern times, the budget the Tories have just delivered to address the disastrous trust budget put a windfall tax on our oil and gas. From that they raised over £80 billion extra. Scotland received just over £1 billion. Yet again, we were ripped off and used as a Westminster cash cow. I'm now going to get the Unionists a little bit excited, because I'm going to agree with one thing that they've said. An independent Scotland will have cuts, but it won't be cuts that they say. The cuts that Scotland will be having is a cut to the monarchy. The budget for the monarchy will be abolished. We will end funding for the House of Lords and the House of Commons. We will stop paying the debts of England. We will no longer be funding illegal wars, and we will end the funding of nuclear weapons on our seas and our lands. Scotland's budget and Scotland's resources will be used to improve the lives of every single Scot. We will also ensure our citizens' rights are protected by a written constitution, to ensure no political party can infringe on our freedoms and our rights. And the first line of that constitution will say, "The people of Scotland are sovereign Now to finish. Poverty is one of the biggest shames of this union. We have people struggling to eat and heat, while supermarkets and energy companies make large profits. We have bankers being handed massive bonuses for failure, while our frontline service staff are being given below inflation wage increases, which is actually a wage cut. Poverty is not natural, it is not a way of life, it is a political choice. And they are able to make these political choices because those it affects are either not on the register to vote or just do not vote, and therefore are not a threat to the political elite. The vote can be a powerful weapon if used properly. If you vote for a candidate best qualified to do the job and not the colour of rosette they are wearing. We need politicians elected who have the political will and the backbone to make changes we need. And that political will must be to have independence of Scotland as their priority, so we can have the powers to end the inequality and the poverty of our nation. Some of you may know these names: Dick Douglas, Andrew Welsh, Gordon Wilson, Margaret MacDonald, Margaret Ewan and Winnie Ewan. I used to speak to each of these with a few drinks at the bar at the SNP conferences. I know how passionate they were about independence. Unfortunately, none of them have lived to see their dream come true. Scotland's future is always in Scotland's hands. Let's not let it slip through our fingers again. Let's unite Scotland, and once again Scotland United will be victorious. But this time it will deliver an independent Scottish Parliament. We can make those dreams of our lost colleagues and friends our reality in their memory. I'll now pass you on to the chairperson, Heather.
So, good evening, folks, and welcome to, I'll use my teacher voice. Good evening, folks, and welcome to the second of our Alba Party Equalities Roadshows. My name's Heather McLean, and I'm proud to be a founding member of the Alba Party and part of the Equalities convener, Eva Comray's Equalities team. We are planning to take these roadshows all over Scotland with the intention of reaching out to ordinary people, getting them signed up to the electoral register and recognise the power they have in their hands by voting. We are here to highlight the injustice of poverty and speak about how we can change things through independence for Scotland. What I find difficult personally, speaking about poverty, is that I've never experienced real poverty. I've experienced hardship and massive debt, and at one point in my life had to go into a trustee. When I was a child, my parents went without so that my sister and I were provided for. I remember my dad at one point was doing 3 jobs. He was a toolmaker in NCR, played in a band at weekends and gave guitar lessons in the evenings to make ends meet. My mum got up at 5 AM and worked as a cleaner in Bell Street Tech. Life was hard, but I've personally never experienced the real hardship faced by some families across Scotland. I've been lucky to have always had a roof over my head, mostly good health, secure work and food in my belly, so I know I can count my blessings in life because I've never personally experienced poverty. However, I do know that's not the case for many people because I saw evidence of it every day in the faces of the children that I've taught. The ones that came to school with no coats in the winter and in the pouring rain. The ones who wore gym shoes because they couldn't afford proper shoes. Or the ones who did gym in their bare feet because they didn't even have gym shoes. The kids who had to depend on charities like Caring for Kids for the one and only Christmas presents because parents couldn't afford Christmas. The kids who got themselves up and came to school with empty bellies because their parents were strung out on drugs or alcohol and there was no money for cornflakes. Yes, councils provide breakfast clubs, but they charge for them because they resent the facility being used as free childminding service. We in the Alba Party believe that school meals should be free for all school children without question of entitlement criteria and no stigma attached to receiving them. I would add, made fresh from good local sources on the premises and not what Dundee City Council do now, which is make them in a central facility to freeze and then they're defrosted at a later date in schools. Bet you didn't know that. School uniform banks and food banks are sadly a necessity for some people, but they're a sticking plaster on what's the biggest problem in Scottish society. Every Dundee school has a trolley at the door with food for folk to take without judgment, because food banks have been commandeered as part of the social security system, and folk who go to food banks can only go a certain amount of times. Most Dundee schools now have school uniform banks, where folk can just take discarded or outgrown clothing without fear of judgment. Something is far wrong in a society where we have more food and clothing banks than actual banks. It's no wonder that people turn to drink or drugs because of the hopelessness of their situation, and this is just another scourge on our society. Children come from broken homes, and along with it are having to cope with screaming matches, people at the end of their tether lashing out, and it's no wonder that families split up and end up living in homeless hostels. I know of children who wandered the streets at night because they didn't want to go home to domestic violence and abuse. I remember being told of one of my pupils in the Hilltown area knocking on a friend of mine's door at 9:30 at night to ask if he could use the toilet because nobody was at home in his own house. He was 8 years old. Goodness knows what would have happened to him if he'd knocked on the wrong door. I look back at class photos of some of these children and wonder what sort of lives they're leading now. I hope they've made a success of their lives and are not trapped in the endless, vicious cycle of poverty. And at the end of having to cope with the trauma of living like this, teachers expect children to settle into the school day and actually learn. I know of teachers in every school in Dundee, because I've taught in a lot of them, who provide breakfast bars and fruit out of their own pocket so that any child coming to school late and hungry can have something to eat. And that is a common occurrence. Charities like Dundee Bairns provide free breakfast and lunches during the school holidays for kids who would otherwise go without. What a sad indictment of our society that thousands of our Scottish families, most of whom are actually in work, have to rely on charity. Something is far wrong when both parents have jobs and yet still have to rely on charity to survive. It's a vicious circle and it goes on and on. Education is one of the key steps out of the cycle of poverty, but not enough money is allocated by governments and councils alike. This is one of the policies the SNP were asked to be judged on. Well, in my book, they failed big time. The average amount spent per capita is a few pounds per child per year. If we really value education, the Scottish Government really needs to put their money where their mouth is and invest in our children. Folk have lost hope, don't believe in politicians and their broken promises, but these are the folk who have most to gain from a Scotland governed by ordinary, competent people in an independent Scotland. Not the career politicians with a degree in politics from university, but ordinary people who have real life experiences of what life is all about and what matters, and a will to make things better in this country, better for everyone. The folk who don't bother to vote because they see their lives as hopeless and that nothing will change are the folk who have most to gain from voting. Why do you think the Tory governments are trying to make things harder for ordinary people by making it compulsory to have photo ID in order to vote? They're doing it because they know that if ordinary people knew about the power they actually possess and took that power, that real change is a political choice. And people in poverty have to shift that dial by getting out to vote for a change in priorities. It's imperative that people are registered to vote and get out to vote to make the real changes that we need in Scotland. The changes we can only make when we are not controlled by a government in another country who tell us what we can or can't do with our own money and resources. Ordinary people have the power to make the changes we need. It's up to us to get out and vote and make those changes happen. And after that rant, On to proceedings and introduce Dr. Tony Cox. As tireless volunteer, activist and advocate for the Scottish Unemployed Workers Network, he informs, supports and accompanies claimants into the Dundee Job Centre. Tony is a long-time supporter of independence and was an active, outspoken, leading voice for Stogie for Aye during the last independence campaign. Tony, over to you.
Thanks very much, Helen. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be invited along tonight and to see so many familiar and friendly faces. And I think tonight, what I'd like to start with, Alan was actually mentioning the 1922 general election victory by Neddy Scrimgeour, and I've actually been working on a biography of Churchill, and it's called the Churchill on the Fringes of Empire, Malakand, Omdurman, Dundee. And the point I would make about the 1922 general election is quite interesting. I didn't realise this until I actually researched it. The extent to which the issue of Scottish Home Rule was right and centre of Neddy Scrimgeour's campaign. When Churchill actually turned up on he only turned up a few days before the actual, the actual election itself, because he contracted appendicitis, and he spoke at a massive meeting. There was about 7,000 or 8,000 in it at the Drill Hall near Bell Street Police Station, what is now Bell Street Police Station, and there was massive riots at that meeting. It basically broke up in complete and utter chaos. And at one point in it, Churchill was attempting to try and play the sectarian card. He kept banging the drum about Ireland and black dads and this and the next thing. And he got booed. And he says, "What you don't want me to talk about Ireland?" No. Well, what do you want me to talk about? Scotland, home rule. And it rang out throughout the entire Drill Hall and completely and utterly took him aback. So again, this is one of these hidden facts of our own history, the extent to which, home rule was actually a major issue on the streets of Dundee, in the 1922 general election. And actually, I think myself, it is an issue that goes all the way back to, before even the Union. When Scotland was actually under military occupation by the English between 1650 and 1660, Monk took up residence in Dundee after the siege of Dundee. And one of the first enactments that was actually put forward at that particular time by Cromwell was wide-ranging land reform. It's actually the most radical form of land reform that's actually been put forward in Scottish history. It's never been better since then. Basically, to take the land away from aristocratic ownership and give tenants absolute freehold rights. Now, that never happened. And David Stevenson, a very good historian in the 17th century, the point that he made, he said it became quite obvious that the Scots lower orders were far too patriotic to actually take the bribe from England. They weren't going to take the bribe from England, and basically it became obvious to them that in some regards the lower orders were ungovernable, and that actually what the English occupying forces in Scotland had to do during the English occupation in Scotland between 1650 and 1660 was change tack, and they shifted tack towards the Scottish aristocracy. Monk started basically wining and dining with the aristocracy and attempted to try and pull them in under English influence, and they had a certain amount of success with that policy. And in 1660, when you had the Restoration, what was the first thing that happened? That the radical land reform was completely and utterly taken off the books. And to this day, we have one of the most open land markets anywhere in Western Europe. And that is not to the benefit of ordinary people. It's a disgrace, and it's disgusting, the extent to which there has been no movement on the issue of land reform in this country. But I digress. The point we're actually gathered here tonight to actually discuss is the issue of ordinary working people and the position that ordinary working people are actually going through at this particular moment in time. Now, the point I would actually make is that one of the issues that is never really discussed and does not get the attention it actually deserves is the impact, the fundamental impact on Scottish society of the deindustrialisation process that we went through from 1979, and it's a process that still continues today. In fact, as a historian, I will actually go further. The point I would make is that there is a fundamental similarity in the causes and consequences of deindustrialisation and how it's been actually impacted upon working class communities throughout Scotland over the last 40 odd years, and the impact, causes and consequences it had during the period of industrialisation. It is remarkable, because that is what I actually look at. I look at the industrialisation process and how it impacted upon this area and how it impacted upon the northeast coast of Scotland. And it is remarkable the extent to which the consequences of deindustrialisation mirror the consequences of industrialisation. What do I mean by that? The first point I would make is that the Industrial Revolution is aptly named that in a Scottish context. Unlike the situation in England, where capitalism slowly emerged from really the 14th and 15th century, it took hundreds of years for land reform, the move towards enclosure, for all that to actually be enacted. But in the Scottish context, this process was telescoped in a period of 40 to 50 years. In the years between 1790 and the 1840s, Scottish society was transformed. And in the process, Scottish society was hollowed out. Fundamental building blocks of society, the social networks, the kin forms of organisation that held society together were basically completely and utterly ripped up over a very, very short space of time. Now, I'll give you an example of this, because it's pertinent. I'm actually doing a lot of work at the moment on the Joneshaven area. My family actually originally came from Joneshaven. I've got an admission for you. I'm not actually a Dundee lad. You can probably tell that from my accent. I'm actually fae Arbroath. I'm an Arbroath lad. But my family actually originally came down to the Joneshaven area in the late 18th century. They were fishermen in that area. Now, maybe found in a kid, they actually moved into the St. Vincent's area in Arbroath, where they became handloom weavers and fishermen. And they moved down at the same time as Mary Brooksbank's ancestors as well. Mary Brooksbank, the famous Dundee socialist, basically, and feminist, but feminist in the good sense of the term, a socialist feminist. Her family actually came from the same area, and they moved down to the St. Vincent's area at the same time as my family. Probably neighbours in some regards. But anyway, maybe a lot of people didn't know this, but in the 1720s, Joneshaven was one of the leading, if not the leading, deep-sea fishing port in Scotland, on the east coast of Scotland. There was 13 large boats there that actually basically carried out deep-sea fishing. Cod and ling were the main catches. Now these boats, there was 10 men on each boat, and they went out during the summer. And the 3 of the men on each boat were actually skippers and had shares in the boats. Now these boats were actually organised on a kin basis. All the men and boys that were actually on those boats were all related to one another. They were cousins, they were brothers, they were fathers, you know, and maybe even grandfathers as well. But anyway, this is a kin-based form of social organisation. We were the clanet society in the 18th century. That continued into the late 18th century. The domination by the Scots, for instance, the East India Company, was put down to the power of cousinship. Because any time a Scot actually got put in a position of responsibility in the East India Company, his cousins quickly followed. You know, and we're like described as a mushroom tribe. You know, anytime one Scot turned up, there'd be platoons coming in behind them. But that was the fundamental basis of society. We existed through our extended kin structures, extended families. That was the whole. We were a clanet society. Now, that was the whole basis as well of social and economic organisation. The fields were actually farmed communal, you know, by groups of kin, closely related kin. And the move towards enclosure pushed many people into John's Haven, you know, and the situation with regards to the fishing. In 1722, there was 13 boats, 10 people in each boat, 130 fishermen, in a very, very small village. There was only about 450 people actually in the village. By the 1790s, there was one boat left, one large boat. Now, what had actually happened? What transpired in that period between? I'll tell you what transpired. The development of the British Empire. The 7 Years' War between 1755 and 63. The American Revolutionary War's independence in 1775 up to 83. And then the Revolutionary Wars against France. And the Royal Navy basically made a point of making a beeline for John's Haven and targeted John's Haven for systematic press ganning. To the extent where the old men and women of John's Haven had to actually patrol the shore to warn of the approach of the Royal Navy vessels coming in to actually seize the young men. In 1763, that year alone, 3 boats were seized by the Royal Navy and the most able men were actually taken off them. And then, basically, a law was enacted where every 5th man who was a seaman actually had to be given up by the community to actually serve. And where were they serving? They were serving in the wars that expanded the British Empire. They were serving in the wars that took over the slave plantations in the West Indies and made sure that India was actually became the jewel in the British crown, the British imperial crown. There was one skipper who basically bought out his right to not be press ganged for the princely sum of £15. And he was seized on his own boat, taken into captivity, press ganged, and he had his certificate, you know, which meant exempt him, his exemption certificate in his top coat pocket. He was taken on to the HMS Salisbury and he died of typhus on the journey out to the West Indies. So, you know, the largest seaport, or the largest deep-sea fishing port on the northeast coast of Scotland was fundamentally hollowed out over a period of 50 to 60 years. Now, what took its place? You know? Well, we're talking about the development of the British Empire. We're talking about the development of major sea power. And in 1727, the British Board of Manufacturers was actually established. Now, the British Board of Manufacturers and Fisheries was established to actually work in the Scottish context. And half of its money was actually given over for linen production, to basically encourage. And the major product they were actually producing was actually sailcloth. Now, the real issue here is, the British Board of Manufacturers and Fisheries was actually established in 1727, but it was meant to have been established in 1707. It was one of these broken promises that actually came out of the Union. And they did not introduce the British Board of Manufacturers and Fisheries until after the Jacobite Revolt of 1715. and until a period where there was mass opposition to the Union on the basis of the economic dislocation and the higher taxation that came as a direct result of the Union in 1707. There was a massive popular antipathy towards the Union when the Union was signed, and that antipathy by the ordinary people, by the lower orders as they were known, did not actually decline, but increased in scope and scale. Now, we're talking about the northeast coast of Scotland. That was an area where Protestantism was quite strong. How do you think the young men who'd been attempted to try and press gang there into the British Royal Navy, how do you think they felt towards the Jacobites as Protestants? This idea that we can basically dismiss the Jacobite revolts as some kind of Catholic minority, royalist, event that only had minority support, did not touch the Protestant majority, is an absolute lie. There was mass support, not just on the northeast coast of Scotland for Jacobitism, but also within Angus as well. In actual fact, the largest levies, or the largest number of recruits, were actually taken from the Angus area, Ogilvy's regiment. And Arbroath and Montrose, all these towns up the ports, up the northeast coast, who'd been subject to press ganging themselves, were amongst the most obdurate foes of Hanoverianism and supporters of the Jacobite cause in 1745 and 1746, but also in 1715 as well. Now, the point I'm making here is that basically what you get is you get the attempt by the British government to attempt to try and cut across the gathering opposition to the Union by attempting to try and buy people off through industrial development. And it did. The industrial development came in train. Weaving schools were established. Weavers were actually brought over from France to give people lessons. And spinning schools were established for women to learn spinning. And from that basis, linen became quickly, a major product in the northeast coast of Scotland, to the extent that the northeast coast of Scotland became one of the cockpits of the Industrial Revolution, not just in Scotland, but in Britain as well. And you see this actually happening in Johnshaven. In exchange for the king-based, independent self-employment of the boats, a lot of families actually had to give that away and actually go into the spinning mills and go into the weaving manufactories that were actually established. And when the first spinning mill was actually, steam-driven spinning mill was established in Scotland in 1787, just up the coast for Johnshaven and Inverbervie, it was English installation engineers that came up to actually install the engine in the mill in Inverbervie, 1787, so the earliest mill in Britain. The same year as they were being introduced in England as well. One of the English engineers actually left an inscription on the engine, and he actually, it's a bit of a legend, he says, it's incredible the extent of the opposition of the women of Inverbervie to the installation of this engine. They believe that their right to employment on their own account has actually been taken away, and everywhere we go, we're spat at, we come under major attack, we're getting attacked in the streets because of this. Now, that story was actually in the 1793 statistical account. It was a minister that actually wrote it. And he put the opposition of the women of Inverbervie to this spinning mill and this engine being actually installed due to their conservatism. There was another explanation as well, which he admitted. He says, these women did not want to become dependent on the mills. Because as spinners in their own right, they were part of a domestic economy. Their men wove in the winter and went out to sea in the summer. They spun, and spinning was a fundamental occupation that was open to women who'd fallen on hard times, spinsters, widows, older women. It was a way in which they could actually earn a living without actually being forced into parochial relief. And this is the issue that I want to get to, maybe in a roundabout way. Because what you actually have, and what you have detailed in this, what I've attempted to describe here, is a slow process, or a rather quick process in the Scottish context. It was much slower in the English context, but very, very quick in the Scottish context. Away from self-sufficiency, based on family and a domestic economy where you were independent, towards dependency. Where you were dependent not just on the spinning master or the weaver manufacturer or the merchant, but you're also on the laird, on the minister, you know. You had a situation in Johnshaven, by the way, where the Episcopalian Church, the Scottish Church, was going a bit liberal at that time, and they were moving towards a much more Episcopalian form of worship. And they wanted to get rid of what they called singing without intermission. And what that was, and you still get it within the Free Church in Scotland, up in the Isles and that today, where you get a precentor sings out the lines, and then the congregation sing the lines back to them. And it's beautiful, you know. And this was actually practiced within the Episcopalian Church in Johnshaven and Benham, in the Benham parish. And the minister was like, no, we're going to get rid of that. We're going to hand out Bibles to Alba, because we just got to read the lines for the Bible. The entire congregation walked out and says, this is discrimination against the illiterate members of our congregation, and we will not stand for it. Now, what we have here, and by the way, what they did was, they said, bugger you, we're out of here. We're organising our own kirk. They brought the relief church minister in, established their own congregation, and it was one of the biggest dissenting ministries anywhere in the north-east coast of Scotland. Now, there's a link here with Dundee, because George Mealmaker, the founder and first secretary of the United Scotsmen, a common weaver who was born and brought up in the Seagate, and who was charged for treason in the 1790s, transported to Australia, and died under dodgy circumstances, face down in a river in 1812 in Australia, just outside in Parramatta, just outside Sydney. He was an elder of the Relief Church. And the Relief Church was a radical church. One of the ministers in the Relief Church in Dundee, and somebody who was an influence on George Mealmaker, was Neil Douglas. Neil Douglas was probably one of the leading opponents of slavery within Scotland. And the Relief Church itself, and the radical politics that came out of the Relief Church, was a founding principle and founding part of the tradition that actually gave rise to Radical Dundee. And we should never forget that. We should never forget where we came from when we're attempting to try and figure out where the hell we're going. Because we didn't care where we came from. How the hell do we get where we're going? We don't. And when we look at our history, and we look at that radical history, and that move away from self-sufficiency towards forced dependency, at the point of banning in some cases, then what we have got to do is we've got to attempt to try and use our knowledge of history and take the history that's been written by the elites, mainly anglicised elites, you know, and take that history away from it, reclaim it, and actually use it as a weapon in order to construct a future. Back to the future, that's what I say. What we need to do, and when we look at this situation with regards, and the way that I've outlined it, this notion of this move away from self-sufficiency to dependency, we see the mirror image of that in the processes that we've all lived through over the last 40 years. I first moved to Dundee in 1983 as a militant full-timer. I was the first militant full-timer in Dundee. George Galloway, in the Labour Party at the time, he went, in the same year, he went away and got a job with Warren One. And in the process, got rid of his own Warren One, because he was on a very, very generous salary. But before he left, he says, he was asked, what's your proudest achievement as a Labour Party member in Dundee? He says, keeping the militant tendency in Dundee. That month we moved in. You know, our first meeting was up in Douglas. We used to meet up there in the Douglas area, a guy called Ewan Duncan. I don't know if anybody knows him. He was a major figure in the Castle and the Rob Caledon sit-ins in the 1970s, and a much-loved comrade in the militant tendency. And the changes that I have seen in Dundee, I moved away as well. I got when the miners' strike broke, I got sent to Fife. I was sent to Glenrothes for my sin. I love Fife, and I've loved Fife ever since. But I was very, very sad to leave Dundee, and I didn't get back to Dundee until the early, in the 90s I came back to do my PhD, and I moved back to live in the early 2000s. So I've actually spent more time in Dundee than I ever did in Arbroath. I love Dundee, I must admit. I mean, it's a place after me in heart. It's an awful lot like Arbroath. It reminds me of Arbroath, and in many ways it's a bigger version of Arbroath. And the first job I ever had was in the Duke. And in the 1980s I well remember Dundee, the hum of the noise of the mills going, and when you come to the station you can smell Dundee, and I didn't mean that in a bad way. And you can smell the hops coming down for the hacky. You can smell the sweeties coming for the keelers. You know, you can smell the jute, that kind of pungent smell of the jute, and you can also smell the coolant oil with the engineering in that as well. There's all these different smells. Every place has a different smell. Always smells the same these days, and not in a good way, generally speaking, with the state of the streets. But the point being here is that process of deindustrialisation, like the process of industrialisation, has been concentrated in such a short space of time, really concentrated. In 40 years, we have seen a fundamental transformation in the whole nature of Scottish society. And the impact that that's actually had on social networks, on community cohesion, on the ability of people to actually resist capital and the bosses and government is very, very much the same. And it's actually getting worse every time. Now, the point I would make here is that what this is about and what it reflects is the fundamental bankruptcy of the Anglo-American neoliberal economic model. And we'll talk about its right name, Thatcherism. Known as Thatcherism, drawn on the economics of the Chicago School, Milton Friedman and all these kind of people. And what we can see now is the fundamental bankruptcy and the way in which this dream of perfect competition, perfect knowledge between buyers and sellers, and everybody will be, you know, happy in this consumer heaven, this attempt to try and create homo economicus, has ended in a nightmare. When we look at our cities, and Dundee is no different from many other places, we are hollowed out. And that hollowing out process, I've got to tell you, will not stop. They will not stop until they are stopped, until we forcibly stop them. And I make this point, and I make no apologies for this. You know, I was a militant in 1983, and I'm probably more of a militant today. That everything that we suspected and feared in the 1980s, remember Scargill said they're coming after our pits. Oh, we're not coming after your pits. That's just propaganda. He's talking nonsense. By the late 80s, Thatcher was making the point we want to turn Britain into an offshore Switzerland. We want to move away from the old smokestack industries. We were like, oh, we're going to do that. We're going to lay the goose that lays the golden eggs. If they've not got a working class, how are they actually going to create wealth? Well, it's through property, it's through finance, through invisible capital, so through, you know, basically squeezing down our rentier population, that's parasitically in another part charging for various services. That's what we're getting. So we're getting this complete and utter hollowing out. And deindustrialisation itself is starting to have a blowback impact on them. If we actually look at the present conflict in the Ukraine, NATO cannot go to war with Russia. America can't go to war with Russia because they do not have the industrial capacity in order to wage a war. They're running out of ammunition, they're running out of tanks, they're running out of everything. You know how many tanks Britain has that are actually serviceable? We have around 40 tanks. We can put a brigade into the field. You know how many people's in a brigade? 5,000, 6,000. 5,000 or 6,000. Dundee get bigger crowds than that. And Dundee aren't even going through very good, you know, in the last few years, and we went through that great a time. This is the situation that we are actually in. The system is bankrupt, it is finished. Now, what is the situation we're getting with regards to the SNP? The SNP have basically embraced that form of capitalism. What are we getting now? Their latest ways is free ports. They're going to get free port status. That used to be common land, it used to belong to us. The commons have been sold off, they've been given to the highest bidder. And what are the free port? What will that be? That will basically be a colony for people who can do what the hell they want. Because once you go through the gates of that free port, they can do what the hell they want. Trade unions aren't going to exist. That's for you know, it's a damn side of a certain thing. So this is the situation that we are in. And the point I would make is a call to arms. We are in the fight of our lives. Because if we actually look at it, I'm going to how am I doing? 1 minute? Okay? You know, we're in the fight of our lives.
A few more minutes.
Few minutes. We're in the fight of our lives here. The point I want to... Sorry?
You've still got time to get your rifle loaded up.
It's a long time since I've done that. The only thing I used to shoot was rabbits, so I wasn't even there. But, you know, we're in the fight of our lives. Because if we actually look at it now, one of our great tragedies, as well as one of the great opportunities for Scotland, is our mineral wealth, our fossil fuel, our wind, you know, our electricity. But this is also, it's not just an opportunity to, in some ways, it is a hindrance to us to actually achieving independence. If we had nothing, say like Finland, apart from wind, I suspect we'd be you know, independent by now. You know, the strategic importance of Scotland as a back door in military terms doesn't exist anymore. If you think about it, I mean, that was one of the reasons why Churchill didn't want to let go of Northern Ireland. He didn't want an aircraft carrier for any future foe. So he wanted to, you know, Ireland actually being turned into an aircraft carrier. So they would keep it under military occupation by having a British presence in the north. Now that doesn't apply to the same extent in the epoch of nuclear conflict, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and now hypersonic missiles that the Russians have got these. That doesn't account. I think if we didn't have any mineral wealth or any fossil fuels or any of this, we would have been independent long ago. We'd been in an awful lot better place. But we do. And we're going to have to try and hang on to it. And the problem with that is that England is also deindustrialised. Not to the same extent. If you go down to the waterfront, we've got the much vaunted tail whale. I think it's the most expensive children's climbing frame I've ever seen in my life. But what do you think of the tail whale? Why is it called the tail whale? When you actually examine it, it was actually constructed in Southampton and floated up and reinstalled in Dundee. We're in a situation now, you know, I mean, a fundamental, I'm just speechless sometimes. We can't even put together a prefabricated whale for tubular metal and construct it in Dundee. We have to get the help of Fountain in Southampton in order to do that. I went to the Kelpies. What were the Kelpies made? The steel was rolled in Middlesbrough and it was put together and manufactured and fabricated in Leeds. That's the reality. And that's a stone's throw away for the Car and Iron Works. And the Car and Iron Works was the first major industrial venture in Scotland. It was manufacturing on a mass scale. It was an iron works in order to turn out armaments. And during the 1820 insurrection, Hardy, Baird and Wilson and the rest of the Scottish martyrs, they marched from Glasgow towards Carron in order to attempt to try and seize Carron and use its armaments in order to establish a Scottish insurrection and establish a Scottish workers' republic in 1820. And now, a stone's throw away from Carron, you've got the Kelpies, which were manufactured and built and developed in Yorkshire and North East Coast England. We are a colony. They have reduced us to dependent status. Now, I'm a historian of the Dundee Jew industry. And I did that in a comparative aspect. I look at everything comparatively. In order to know where you are, you've got to put yourself in relation to other folk. Now, when we look at the Dundee Jew industry, its relationship with Calcutta, I looked at India quite a lot. And one of the things about the British relationship with India was the determined effort on the part of the British elites in order to keep India in a dependent status. And how did they manage that? By attempting to prevent them from developing the skills and techniques to develop their own industry. And it was the breakthrough by Marwari Indian manufacturers in the jute industry in Calcutta that put the nail in the coffin of the imperial control of the jute industry, in an imperial context. And what are we now? We have no industry, nothing. We are a dependent nation. We are a colony. We are now more of a colony than we were back in the 17th century. And that's the truth of the matter. We're certainly more of a colony than any other time since the Union. We are now being anglicised, and we are now they're going on for towards the attempt to try and turn us and transform us into simply another region within the British fabric. That is going to be the next attack, and the next attack will be on Holyrood. But this is the situation that we're in. And I thought I would make these comments in order to put this whole issue about the situation that we face and our people face. I've got a lot of material, I'm always over-prepared for these things. But some of the statistics are absolutely shocking. And the points that I'm making about the link between deindustrialisation, there is a fundamental link between deindustrialisation and poor health outcomes. In the Scottish context. The so-called Glasgow effect. A whole number of Scottish academics have been doing pioneering work and attempting to try and nail why Glasgow, that's went through similar process of deindustrialisation to Manchester and Liverpool, has worse outcomes. And the point that they're making is that a lot of it's to do with history. And what they keep going back to is the time where we actually saw an uptick in mortality and health outcomes. It was from the period 1945 up to 1979. In that period, male and female mortalities were reversed, women started living longer than men, and health outcomes became much, much better. And it went in a steep decline and then steep reverse after 1979. So we have this situation where it is becoming increasingly apparent that Scotland is not just suffering because of its industrial legacy. It's suffering again because of the this huge and convulsive step towards deindustrialisation. When you have suicide rates of the rate that they are, you have the youth turning towards drugs to the extent that they are, that suggests to me a society that's in deep crisis, a society that's under deep stress. And if we are to relieve our people, I'll just finish here, if we are to relieve our people, we need independence as soon as possible. Scotland free or a desert.
I'm going to pass it on now to Karen Waddell, otherwise known as Grouse Peter.
Reader.
Grouse Peter. Blogger, film producer, scriptwriter, film critic, essayist, He's got more strings to his bow than a string quartet, and here he is.
Kind of geek-bashed the meeting tonight, which is why I'm not on the credits, but Eva invited me, and I feel obliged because I am, after all, the first honouring member of Alba. How are we going to get independence? Alexander's exactly correct. It's us. You're the people who voted yes in Dundee, and the working class of Glasgow, Greater Glasgow. And you were betrayed. And those who were betrayed by the middle class. Some of us who live in Edinburgh, who are not, we don't have our heads decolonised yet. You know, we still think the culture down south is superior to us. And so we should cloak ourselves with the mantle of being ersatz English. And my attitude to that is, they acknowledge their own values. You go there, and you can only admire some of these chocolate box villages with the thatched cottages that they've kept so well for a few hundred years. And then you start thinking about our villages, which are rickles of little stone after the clearances. And you start to weigh these things up. So he's quite correct, Alexander, when he says it is up to us to tell the powers that we want our country's liberty back again. And that means a convention. Don't ask me who should sit on it. I might offend somebody who wants to be on it. But I hope they are people of erudition. I hope they are people who've got a thick skin and are robust and can get attention. And if you've noticed Twitter, I changed Twitter because it's useless for debate, for political debate. I changed it to a news item, you know, but with some satirical comments on the items. And I use it to advertise my long form essays and articles in the other site I have, the WordPress site. Twitter has changed in the last 2 years, and I don't mean Musk. It moved away from communication. Hi, how are you doing? Do you want to go to the pictures tonight? You know, do you want to meet up at the pub? To this huge political rush of material. And it's got abusive. So that taught me the way you get attention is to say something outrageous, something extreme, as you would in any normal debate. That's the way to get attention. So that group, that convention of not too many people will need to have thick skins and not be afraid of being disliked, because they'll get pelted from the people who want us, as you said, to remain in a country that is dependent. You know, we are inferior. The second thing that we're going to need is a colonial unit. Small group of really smart people who know about colonialism, who know how it affects our everyday lives, because there's a lot of people who think because they can choose which store they can get the shopping from, they can buy the second-hand car, they've got the school for their kids, what else do they need? There are people like that who just don't know how their lives are being shaped by mysterious forces out there. At my level of work, and I see them, I meet them. My wife met them. She was elected. You don't ask for membership at the Royal Academy. You're elected by your peers, right? They all say, this woman's a bloody good painter and master printmaker. But she's Scottish. Well, I have to think about this. And sure enough, when 2014 came along, head of the Royal Academy back then said to her, I say, Barbara, I take it that once your nation's independent, you'll be resigning from the Academy. So, I mean that every day. I see it every day. Like Channel 4 saying to me, right, we're going to give you £2.5 million to make a political thriller, Gav. I know it's all set in Glasgow, but we'd much rather you work down in London with a London company. Give a production company down here the project, because we like dealing with people just down the road. Hold on a minute. Mr. Isaacs, you're Glaswegian. You were given a commission to represent the whole of the UK. This film is going to be made in Glasgow with a Glaswegian cast. And it was. And unlike Trainspotting, it didn't get subtitled when it went to America. And I'm very proud of that. It's on DVD now, which I didn't know. So I've written to the new female head of Channel 4 and said, where are my bloody royalties? You haven't told me that you are issuing a DVD, just as I was never told this production won an American award. But that, you know, they're down there. They don't have to tell us. You know, we're just not accoutrement to whatever they do. The next thing simultaneously is a section 50, in which the appointed people go along to see King Charles and say, we're taking our independence because we have majority in the Parliament, and so we need you to sign here. I was interviewed last night on a German podcast thing, and Sarah Sayers was one of the speakers, and she got straight at me immediately. And she said, no, he's not King of Scotland, we don't have to do this. And she gave all the right historical, legal reasons. We're not asking for his permission. We're telling him, sign this. You're the King of England down there, and your jurisdiction here is now limited. And the last thing we need to do is get a group together to go to the United Nations. That could be you. Yes, no, and you put forward exactly what you have said about the history of Scotland. You know, we have to keep that big group there in the colonial committee. And the thing that we have to do is to get another country to endorse us. And as I said the other day, the natural one is to go to Ireland. But if the Parliament there, if the Dáil there are a bit coy about it, well, we'll go to Iceland, because they absolutely hate the Brits. So, that's everything. So what's the weakness about that? There's a weakness in every rock-solid plan. Illness. God's intervention. The airplane crashes that you're going across to New York. In our case, it's we've had a nationalist government with no backbone, who had a majority and squandered it, who had only to say, as Mia Mottley said of the Barbados, the Prime Minister, we canvassed the people in Barbados to become a republic. We have the majority of seats, we're becoming a republic. And of course, like Scotland, full of colonial watchdogs and little unionists and Tory MSPs with no mandate for anything, she had her opponents in Barbados, one of which was their Barbados newspaper, incidentally called The National. You must have a referendum. You can't take the right away from people by calling us a republic. And Mia Mottley said, she's on film, you can find it on Google or YouTube. I've just won an election and I've got the majority of seats. Why should I go back to the people with a referendum to ask the same questions? So it's exactly as people have been saying. You do it. And you've heard your friends saying it. Why don't we just take our independence? Well, you need a goddamn nationalist party who is nationalist and absolutely dedicated to doing that. We're going to ruffle a few feathers. I mean, it's a social revolution we're involved in. People are going to feel outraged. You know, I've been living here in the borders for 40 years, and I'm very happy here. I play cricket every weekend, and you're going to upset all of that. Why are you doing this to us? Because, my friend, if you're a Democrat, we won a bloody major load of seats. So it can be done, but our weakness is the SNP. Yep. And as colonial history will tell you, when the nationalist party starts to accommodate the oppressor, new parties, the new nationalist parties will arise. A new route. So, with my cancer, I don't know if I'll get there. But if I don't, I'll be bloody furious if you give up. Thank you for listening.
Who won't give up, Eva, who is our equalities convener, and real life bionic woman, just as well, because she needs the energy, and I'm proud to call her my friend, Eva.
Thank you very much. I was scrolling through a phone when he was speaking, probably in the mood. What I was actually looking for was a photo that I have of an entry in the census for Lochee for 1921. And it's my granddad and some brothers and sisters and his dad. Is that better? Just shout.
No, you could use the mic.
My granddad was born in 1901 in Lochee. Some of you know this story. He ran away to the war when he was 14, and I think he was probably about 4 feet 11. He joined the Loyal North Lancs because he couldn't join the Scottish regiment because they wouldn't have had him. But the North Lancs would take anybody to go and fight that war. When my granddad returned, he came back to live in a Dundee and a Lochee that was pretty impoverished, and stayed with his family in a tenement. I'm not sure how many of them there were eventually in the family, but it was at least a dozen. My granddad, though, signed up again, was a regular soldier and fought right through in various campaigns. Rumour has it he was a black and tan. I really hope he wasn't, but I think somehow he was. And he would speak in pretty awful terms about Churchill and related matters. After the Second War that he fought through too, when he was in the Home Guard, he was a miner in Fife, and over time I think the trauma of the wars and the horrible things that he had seen worldwide, he'd been in war or fighting for the British in various places, including China and places that you've never heard of before or since, such as Western Thrace, Mesopotamia and Constantinople, as he would have called it. He was a traumatised man, like so many others, and saw accidents in life in the pits and the mines too. But ultimately, one of the greatest things that ever happened to him was in the early 1950s, when his family were allocated a brand new council house in Kennelly, one inside toilet, and there was an NHS, and people stopped dying unnecessarily and prematurely. So for my granddad, for so many others like him, the Labour Party and all the good things that they did were the right things that needed to be done in Scotland in those days. But eventually, come the late 70s, the late 60s, my granddad had been converted to become a Scottish nationalist, because he realised what we all know, and so many others in Scotland know, and as you two have already said, and Heather has pointed out the impact of it, the Union isn't working for Scotland, it never has worked for Scotland, it never will work for Scotland. It's all the other way about. And the proof of the pudding is there for all to see today. I think it was today that British Gas announced their half-year profit. Now, I want to get the figure right on this, so bear with me please, because it's really important.
That'll be because of my 1,649 units that I used in 20 days.
Here we go. British Gas profits for half the year, £969 million.
Wow.
This arises in part because of the rises in the price caps, but they now propose to pay a massive hike in dividends, etc., and at least 2 million households in the UK cannot afford their gas bills. In addition to that, there's new figures out today in relation to homelessness in Scotland, and at the moment there are 243,603 Scots on the waiting list to be housed. The drugs figures are due out. The drugs deaths figures at the moment appear to be at least 100 Scots dying every month. That's the price of the Union. The budget of the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government, is of the order of 60 billion. Scotland's income, excluding the North Sea, is of the order of 70 billion. We're neither too wee nor too poor. When I said to you there's about 100 people dying a month from drugs death at the moment, I can take you back to 2021, which is the worst year on record. This year might be worse. 1,330 people died drugs deaths that year. However, in terms of statistics and where poverty really matters, you're 15 times more likely to die a death from drugs in the most deprived than in the least deprived areas of Scotland. Alcohol-specific deaths continue to increase in certain areas, notwithstanding minimum unit pricing. And at the moment, you're 5 and 6 times more likely to die an alcohol-related death in the most deprived than in the least deprived areas. A similar position applies in relation to suicide, which is 3 to 5 times more likely in the most deprived than in the least deprived areas of this country. There is absolutely no reason why our people are dying other than poverty is not being addressed, it's not being tackled by politicians who lack the political will and the strategy and the commitment to deal with those things the way they ought to be dealt with. Were we an independent country, we would not be spending money on the abomination on Clyde. We would prioritise housing. We could have, as Kenny McCaskill said today, a national house building company. One of the greatest causes of poverty is that people pay far too much for their housing costs. We could have a national energy company where the energy of the North Sea is used to heat and to power the homes of the people of Scotland first before it goes anywhere else. We would stop that rip-off that we've encountered ever since North Sea oil was discovered. Well, they stole our oil, hell mend them, we're not going to let them continue to steal the wind and water as well. Beyond that, we can do far more for Scotland with our independence than Westminster will ever do, because the money that is earned in Scotland will stay in Scotland. It won't go south to bankroll Westminster or any of the vanity projects that Westminster seems to want to pursue, whether you're Tory or Labour. And for anybody who's even contemplating for a moment voting Labour, ask yourself why it is that Keir Starmer is refusing and has done an about-turn in relation to overturning the two-child cap on benefit, otherwise known as the rape clause. He's done that because he couldn't care less about the children beyond the first 2, not because he's a man without a heart, but because it's a policy that he knows will garner him votes if he keeps it in place. He's as Tory as the Tories ever were, and he's Thatcher Mark 10. So, in Scotland, as I think Alan had mentioned, a few years ago now, Alex Salmond was able to mitigate the impact of the bedroom tax. The Scottish Government could do that tomorrow in the context of the two-child cap, the rape clause. They simply refused to do so. I don't understand why, because they could use that. They could use the fund just now, which is used in connection with council tax benefit, to mitigate completely and remove completely the impact of the two-child rape clause. We've been told that often enough. Mitigate that tomorrow if you really wanted to. Beyond that, what the Scottish Government could be doing and signally refused to do is to provide, again as Alan said, free school meals throughout the education of our children. Now, it's been fully costed by the Alba Party. It would cost less than 2% of the Scottish annual budget to make sure that every child in Scotland, nursery, primary and secondary level, had a good meal, probably a breakfast as well as a lunch. And we need to do that for our children, because if you're not arriving at school already fed, if you arrive there hungry and you're not fed while you're there, you are not going to learn, you're not going to settle, you're not going to get an education to enable you to begin to fulfil your own potential. And that is a duty that I think any decent government owes to every child, right throughout their childhood, regardless of circumstance. And see those folk that complain that universal benefits are wrong. Well, see if you think you're middle class and you're well off and you're not needing universal benefits, might I suggest that you take the universal benefits and you put your hand in your back pocket and you take out a wad of notes and you fling it in a school fund or a charity or any other deserving area that you can find. On the subject of school meals, we know that pupils in the past have been stigmatised as the result of having free school meals that are means tested, and that's as good a reason as any in a land of plenty for doing away with means testing. When you get on to that subject though of children and their education, we also know that there are serious issues in education that Heather will be able to speak about at length in respect of how the Scottish Government have tackled matters. What could be done if there were political will? Immediately, overnight, would be to review the employment contracts of short-term or supply teachers so that teachers could remain in post and not get a job for a year or so at a time, not be able to progress with their own life, get a mortgage, get settled, and do things that other folk take for granted. So there's a massive canvas that Scotland could write upon when had the ability to use our own resources for the purposes of looking after our own people. The NHS being another case in point, it is being strangled by the use of agency staff, consultants and nurses, and that's in part because we don't have powers, proper powers, where we can attract immigration from the countries where we would like to attract people as qualified workers. The numbers of nurses that are actually now going to college in Scotland, from Scotland, are continuing to plummet, and that is not good. You'll see figures from the Scottish Government also in relation to police, doctors, graduates, all different walks of life, where it's suggested that the numbers are on the increase. That's the gross numbers, that's not the net numbers. There are employment issues in very many professions and jobs across Scotland now, but we're signally unable to tackle unless and until we've got the full powers of a normal, independent country. So I go back to the beginning, I was talking to you about my granda in 1921, living in an overcrowded tenement in Lochee. There are people in Scotland living in overcrowded homes today, 102 years later. We've just seen record homeless deaths in Scotland of a couple of hundred in the last couple of years. I've quoted to you the numbers of people that are on house and waiting lists. None of this is necessary. None of this should be happening in our country. But the way to fix this is not simply to say, let's all vote for independence. As we've all agreed, there are an awful lot of people out there that are not registered to vote. We need to encourage them to vote. We need to give them hope. We need to prove to people it's worthwhile being on the register. You'll not get chased for council tax arrears if you're on the register and you're voting for independence, whether it's in a Scotland United election or some sort of plebiscite type election in the Scottish Parliament. But in the fullness of time, what could be done in Scotland if there was political will is there could be a Scotland United campaign for the next Westminster general election, where all independent supporting parties only agree to have on each ballot paper in each constituency one independence candidate alone, so that the independence vote is not split and people are not competing with each other. Those votes will likely achieve a majority of the popular vote as well as a majority of seats. If we have the ridiculous position presently set out by both the SNP and the Greens, whereby they'll all stand wherever they want to stand and probably cover every seat, all that will happen is the vote will be split. There might be a majority of a majority of seats for one particular party, but that can be achieved on about 35% of the popular vote and is not very likely to be recognised either by Westminster or internationally as a mandate to negotiate independence. So if we want a mandate to negotiate independence, the answer is a majority of the popular vote, that's of the votes cast, is a legitimate mandate that internationally will be recognised, and Westminster would be foolhardy in the extreme to ignore. If there is not a Scotland United campaign for the next general election, then what the Scottish Government could do, and they could be doing this now, and you know this from Angus Brendan McNeill as well as from the Alba Party, you can collapse Holyrood and you can have an early Scottish parliamentary election where again there can come into play the question of the supermajority, whereby a majority of MSPs elected can be elected on an independence ticket, and again, that has legitimacy internationally. So there's a lot that Scotland can do, but it won't happen unless and until the elected politicians who are looking after their own seats understand that the people have had enough. They are reminded that the people are sovereign, and those people who are not registered to vote become registered to vote, and that way, when we achieve that mandate to negotiate the terms of poverty and inequality, and make way the land is supposed to be.
Okay, so now you'll see on the tables that there are there's sheets with for questions. So we'll take questions after the briefing, which will be open in about 2 minutes. Once I get the foil off them. Please have some food
After the food.
prepared this afternoon. So help yourselves,
We'll go on
and
straight
if
from
you've
the
got
food.
questions, write them down. Denise will come down and Denise over here will come down and collect any questions, and we'll address them after the briefing. Okay?